This event, at its core, is a celebration, a recognition and appreciation of your leadership and of the strength of our Jewish community. But given the emotions we all share as a result of the horrific shooting last night in Las Vegas, celebrating anything right now may seem inappropriate, or at least very difficult. I know that when I woke up this morning and heard the news of what had transpired, I felt overwhelming helplessness at the randomness of this heinous act and the incomprehensible loss of human life. But when I think about it, when I step back, there's a certain poignancy to the fact that we have collected and gathered here together this evening. We are here to honor community and to express our gratitude at being given the opportunity to help people who desperately need our aid and support. That is what Federation is about. And if there were ever a time for us to double down on our humanity, a time to make a statement about the values that we believe should carry the day, then it is entirely fitting and appropriate for us to gather here tonight to vigorously pursue our purpose. While our hearts and prayers are with the victims and the families of those in Las Vegas, as well as the people of Puerto Rico who are struggling to survive in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, perhaps the most impactful thing that we can do is what we are doing right here, right now. We are honored to share this responsibility with you. And as we begin the new year, 5778, we know that it will be a year of joy and growth in our community due to your leadership and your dedication. I'm privileged to invite Jewish Federation President Neil Blatt to say a few words.
All right, thank you, Scott, and thank you all for coming. I'm very optimistic about the direction of our community as we kick off the 2018 Federation Annual Campaign here tonight. The board and I have been heartened to witness renewed energy. We already have almost 3 times as many campaign volunteers at the start of this campaign as we had last year at this time. And we are enthusiastic about the important and worthy endeavor we and our fellow campaign volunteers are undertaking. That of offering our friends, colleagues, and fellow community members an opportunity to do a mitzvah, to foster and sustain Jewish life locally and around the world. I'd like to thank the campaign volunteer team, headed by our annual campaign co-chairs, Babette Levy-Daskin and Steve Gerber. And our women's philanthropy co-chairs, Joyce Gerber and Sarah Wall. I would like to invite all of our campaign volunteers here tonight to rise so that we can recognize and thank you. So we are also honored to have the professional and lay leadership of many of our local partner agencies join us this evening. I'm pleased to welcome Dave Stone, Executive Director of the JCC. Anya Abramson, Executive Director of Jewish Family Services. Susan Fisher, President of the Board of Jewish Family Services. And Jen Rosenberg, Hebrew Day School's Head of School. I also want to thank all of our co-chairs for tonight's wonderful gathering, Cindy and Scott Kellman, and Carey and David Sherman. So we are grateful for your leadership and look forward to the rest of the lovely evening. Thank you. Neil. It's great to see everybody. Well, all right, thank you, Scott. Are you up now?
I think so.
Why
don't we do it together?
I'm so excited to be up here. All right, I'll let you. I'll see y'all later.
So Cindy and I, along with Carey and of course David, are honored to be a part of what we know is going to be a moving, entertaining, and informative evening. We're grateful for the generous support that Jeff Krause of Edward Jones has provided by underwriting the cost of this evening's event. Thanks, Jeff. Where's Jeff? I also know that we all enjoyed the fabulous White House-inspired meal crafted for us by Lori Shepard of Simply Scrumptious. Lori's kosher food is not only always delicious, but always carries that special element of creativity that makes our culinary experience exceptional. We really appreciate her efforts. We also want you to know that we offer our condolences to Lori and her family during this difficult time. Lori's father actually passed away last Friday. And so she's not here with us tonight, but we wish her the best. And we also offer sincere thanks to her staff who have carried on in her absence, and I thought did everything flawlessly this evening, and really appreciate it. Perhaps most essential is to thank our dedicated Federation professional staff who saw to every detail of this evening's program. Please join me in thanking the Federation team of Cindy Adams, Denise Bennett, Max Glick, and Ayelet Shapiro, led by our interim executive director, Eileen Freed.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Finally up here. All right. So we're really honored to be co-hosting today, Carey and I, with Cindy and Scott. And you know, Carey's been very visible, and it's really wonderful to be participating and serving in this capacity with Carey today. So the major gifts event is a unique component of our annual campaign. As you know, we're among the leaders of this community, and we have a very special opportunity tonight to start this year's campaign in a very impactful way. We all understand the importance of this communal model that we're here to celebrate. This model enables individual donors, like all of us, to have a far greater impact by joining together to maximize our community strengths. Together, we ensure that we can meet the needs of our local community and also communities anywhere in the world. No person, Jewish or non-Jewish, should live in distress, fall through the cracks, or be left out in the cold. Tonight, we want to share with you 3 short stories to illustrate the impact of your steadfast and generous support. We trust, like I do, you will feel moved and be very proud of the work Jewish Federation is doing on our behalf. Okay.
We have about 3 big operations from Yemen. The first one was the magic carpet, where 50,000 Jews were brought on Aliyah to Israel. And then one last wave, where 50 Jews come on Aliyah, among them the father and grandfather, grandmother of the family of many.
I have a lot of memories from Yemen, a lot of memories about the way we were treated as Jews. Just on our way to school, we would be stoned.
It's really difficult to bring the last people because there is a complete chaos in Yemen, because you have a lot of threat, okay? You have Al-Qaeda, you have ISIS.
I've been worried about my family's safety since the day I left Yemen. I wake up in the morning and I go to sleep always thinking about their safety. Are they going to be okay? What if something happens to them? I've waited for this day for 10 years, Every day I just wake up in the morning thinking about the day that I'm actually going to be together with my family again. And today it's finally happening. I'm so grateful for the Jewish Agency and the Jewish Federation for working together to bring my family to safety and for all the support that they have provided along the way. Good morning. What an honor and privilege to be here with you this morning. It's only been a few months since I reunited with my family, and there are times when it's still hard to believe that we're actually all together again. It's hard. It's a hard thing to be separated from your family for 10 years, especially while you're still growing up. But throughout that whole time, I had a larger family looking out for me. I had you. Because of that larger family, I was welcomed into Jewish homes in cities across the United States. And today, I'm living in New York. Getting an education, a real education, giving me a genuine shot at a great future, something that never could have happened in Yemen. But it's not just my family we've cared for and supported, and even rescued. Every day I meet people from Yemen, Ukraine, Ethiopia, from countries all over the world, who have new lives, who are able to live openly, Jewishly, in a place where they can feel safe. And without you, none of it would have been possible. So with all my heart, I thank you for all of us. Thank you.
What an amazing person. Because of us, Jews like Manny and his family are able to escape from lives of poverty, discrimination, insecurity, and fear. Even as we sit here tonight, our partners at the Jewish Agency are rescuing Jewish people in distress, literally running covert operations to extract them from places like Yemen, Syria, Iran, and Venezuela. This is what it means to be part of a global community. Together we are an incredible force for helping the good of our global community. Even today, the strength of our communal federation system has been in full view through the rapid responses to the devastation and damage caused by the recent hurricanes. These catastrophes caused significant trauma in Houston, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean. Our federation family was able to mobilize very quickly and effectively to raise funds, address immediate needs, and help communities rebuild for the future. Here's a quick video that depicts just a sliver of the Federation's response in Houston.
Portion of the 16,000 items ordered by JFNA's National Young Leadership Cabinet from around the country.
If you need volunteers to come in and do the muck work at your home, we now have volunteers running out from the Jewish Federation. Together as beautifully as this community has. So thank you everybody out there for your support.
incredible responsiveness of Jewish communities is only possible through the communal connections and infrastructure we make possible together. This is what it means to be part of a federated community, and this is what we are all here to support tonight. Carey.
Good night, good evening, everybody. Not good night, it's a little dark in here, but I just have to say I've seen that video now 6 times, and every time I kind of get choked up because it really is exactly what we're doing here tonight. We're also here tonight, and really all throughout the year, because we each care deeply and individually about our Jewish identities, and we care deeply about passing on a vibrant identity and community for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. Increasingly, parents are looking to us and our organizations and agencies to support their efforts to raise engaged and educated Jewish children. Federation programs and our local agencies enable meaningful Jewish experiences, from the Hebrew Day School, family education programs, Jewish summer camps, and trips to Israel. You, each of you, are our most significant partners in making these opportunities possible. Now, I'd like to ask Liz Wirba to speak about our Federation's unique Ann Arbor Nahalal exchange, and for you to hear directly about the impact of some of our programs.
Hello and welcome. I'd like to share, am I standing in the right spot? Okay. I'd like to share how the programs supported by the Jewish Federation of Ann Arbor have been essential in developing our family's Jewish identity. My husband and I have 2 sons. Jonah, with the beard, is 20, and Max, pictured here, is 17. Both boys participated in the Nahalal P2G exchange in 9th grade. It was a memorable trip for our older son. He loves to travel, and he learned a lot about Israel, especially about the Northern Galilee region. The big surprise was how he bonded with the Nahalal youth on his trip. And that connection stayed strong long after the trip. When the Nahalal teens joined us 6 months later here at Ann Arbor, he and his Ann Arbor peers excitedly planned activities and hung out with them as much as they could. 3 years later, Max, the younger one, had an equally amazing experience in Israel. One additional benefit for Max was getting to know more Jewish teens from Ann Arbor. We have many Jewish neighbors. Our local high school has a small Jewish population. The trip allowed him to renew his friendships with kids he already knew, and allowed him to meet and strengthen his connection with other local Jewish teens. On a more serious note, I think the trip also came at a time when Max was thinking about what it means to be Jewish, due to some, sadly, anti-Semitic experiences in our own community. We happen to live a few doors down from the founder of an anti-Israel and Holocaust denial group. Our neighbor had anti-Israel messages stamped into the sidewalk and driveway, and an anti-Israel flag hanging from a tree in his front yard, so that just walking the dog was enough to put us into daily contact with the idea that someone could dislike us just for being Jewish and for supporting Israel. I think the Nahalal exchange gave Max a feeling of belonging and pride that affirmed his Jewish identity. He has proudly worn a chain with a Magen David pendant over his t-shirt for years. I think you can see it in that picture, demonstrating how he really owns being Jewish. He noted this past week in his shift at Mike's Slate ice cream shop where he works, that many patrons greeted him with Shana Tova, and this made him really happy and proud. I would say that the Nahalal exchange spurred his interest in diving deeper into his Jewish heritage, and he subsequently spent a month last summer on the BBYO passport trip to Israel, gaining a broader view. Lastly, the exchange had an added benefit for me and my husband David. we started to feel like it was finally our turn to go to Israel. David had never been there, and I had not visited since college, so we planned our trip to coordinate with our son's visit, and the three of us were able to spend 3 days in Nahalal, hosted by 2 separate families. The whole community was just incredibly hospitable, wining and dining us. Overall, this program has had a profound effect on both of our sons. Each of them returned to Israel following the program, one going on Birthright, our older son, and the other one on a BBYO trip. And they both found renewed interest and pride in their heritage as they became teenagers. So we feel fortunate to have these programs and organizations that partner with parents to foster Jewish identity in their kids. In addition to the student exchange, our family has benefited from many other programs that receive generous support from Federation donors, including the Jewish Community Center of Ann Arbor's preschool, aftercare programs, summer camp, holiday programming, and Maccabi Games, Hebrew Day School of Ann Arbor, my sons are both graduates, and Keshet High School Hebrew program. I want to thank you personally. I want to thank Federation for having made all of this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. You really reflect and express exactly what that program does for teens and for families. Since 2010, over 100 Ann Arbor teens have participated in the student exchange. This is a really unique program nationally, and we should be very proud of it. It really is one of the jewels of our federation. And these kids stay in touch and go back to Israel and really have a different trajectory as Jews because of this kind of program, because of this program. And it really is Federation and your support that make it possible. They get to know Israel in its complexities, commonalities, and differences, and that is all we can ask from any kind of Jewish program. This kind of program and all of the programs are really how we can ensure the future of our community and the Jewish people. Tonight, specifically, we have a really rare opportunity to set our federation on an even stronger course and to leverage our individual and collective gifts for maximum effect. Our friend and staunch supporter, Mike Levine, has provided the community with a gift of $25,000 over and above his increased annual gift to basically challenge us in a one-time gift, again, over and above our increased individual gifts, to raise collectively an additional $25,000. Beginning with the main event, all new and increased gifts from the whole community will be matched by this combined challenge fund of $50,000. You see, I'm assuming we're going to raise at least $25,000 tonight. We hope that this challenge will really engage and motivate the rest of the community to step up and increase their support as we're asking each of you to do tonight. We can reach this goal easily. I mean, you can all do the math. If 20 people gave so much, and if 100, but we're 100 people in this room. And so we can do this much. We can raise $25,000 at the very least. So I'm really going to ask and let's just make this happen, is basically what I want to say. I think that we can each do as much as we can to meet and really leverage this remarkable opportunity. We can jumpstart our Federation's annual campaign by demonstrating the leadership it takes to build and sustain a strong and caring community. Community doesn't just happen by itself. As you all know, you are the foundational members of this community, and we really turn to you and thank you for your sustained generosity. But I hope tonight you will really think, and I really feel that given what is going on out there in our country and in the world, We have so much to be grateful for. We're so fortunate, and we have so much work to do. And so by increasing your pledge and by really stepping up to meet the challenge of this unique one-time additional gift, we can really help foster Jewish life, the life we want and the life that we can imagine for both Ann Arbor and for the greater global Jewish community. So if ever there was a time to raise your gift and to provide for this one-time additional match, this is the time. So please take a few minutes, moments, imagine how much more we can accomplish together, and dig deep. Thank you very much for being here. You'll find the cards, I believe, and you already have them. Look inside. There's a special card for the one-time gift, and I really hope you will join Cindy, Scott, David, and myself in this really unique opportunity. And I want to thank you all for being here very much.
He was the first Western journalist to interview Mikhail Gorbachev after his historic meeting with Ronald Reagan. We are delighted to have Jeff here with us this evening. Warm welcome for Jeff.
Thank you all very much, and special thanks to Eileen Freed and Cindy Adams and everybody else at the team here and the board, and a special shout out to Dr. Barry Neiman for introducing me to Eileen Freed to enable my coming here this evening. So it's a great pleasure. And it is a great pleasure to be with you all here this evening. For the past 40 years, I've been in front of the camera, behind the camera, and now I'm here in front of all of you to share some of the biggest stories that I covered in the last decades. My career started down in Birmingham, Alabama, at an NBC affiliate there, and I was something of a novelty being a Jewish guy on the air there back then. My news director decided that I should use my middle name on the air, Scott. So I was Jeff Scott, Newswatch 13. My colleagues all knew that I was Jeff Goldman. One day I was assigned to do a story in downtown Birmingham to a subject you're all familiar with, where central business districts back then were being killed by those newfangled suburban shopping malls. We interviewed lots of merchants downtown about the plight that they faced, and one of the stores we went into at the time was a jewelry store. The owner there had a rather obvious name, like Izzy Cohen. Mr. Cohen, after we did the interview, he had a very heavy Southern accent. And he looked me up and down, and he said, "What'd you say your name was again?" "Jeff Scott." He said, "I don't see any Scott in you." My cameraman started laughing so hard he almost dropped the camera on the floor. I said, "You're right, Mr. Cohen. It's Jeff Scott Goldman. Great to meet you." He said, "I knew it. I'll see you in Temple." And we did. Of course, 40 years later, lots has changed, and I'm very proud to be Jeff Scott Goldman. After working in local stations around the country, I moved back east to Washington, D.C., where I started at the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour on PBS, where I worked for 12 years, and then moved across town to the CBS News Network Bureau, where I spent the last 21 years before retirement a few months ago. As you heard, I've had the honor and privilege of covering 6 American presidents, starting with the second term of Ronald Reagan. Each president, of course, was rather unique to cover, and some got along with the press well, some not so much, as we see today. In fact, I covered President-elect Donald Trump during his transition period to becoming president. I was one of those reporters that was sent up to New York to cover the famous Trump Tower elevator vent there, watching people coming and going, vying for position with the new administration. One of the very first people I saw marching there to see Mr. Trump was Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who, of course, when I called out, would you be interested in taking a position with the new administration, said he'd be delighted to. And now, of course, he's Attorney General. There were other people I had daily interactions with there, like Kellyanne Conway, who could not get enough of being with the press. She quite liked her new famed celebrity status up there. But there were some other people that didn't want to be with the press so much, like son-in-law Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon. They darted in and out of the Trump Towers repeatedly and made sure they stayed well away from the press that was standing there in the lobby. There were surprise visitors coming to see the president-elect then, including Steve Harvey, the game show host, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For those of you that don't know, RFK Jr. is one of those that believes there may be a link between childhood vaccines and autism. It seemed the president-elect had some special interest in it during that time. During the campaign, I saw then-candidate Trump start his attacks on the press. I never saw it in person, though, because I was out with President Obama, who, of course, was stumping for Hillary Clinton around the country. And one day I got a full dose of it when now President-elect Trump in December went down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to stump for a GOP Senate candidate there with the unlikely name of John Kennedy, who was in a runoff campaign there. So here we were in Baton Rouge, and it was a standard rally, and he was singing the praises of Mr. Kennedy as the candidate. Then suddenly he started attacking the press verbally. I was in the back of the room by the camera platform, and all of a sudden when he said those words, the crowd of about 2,000 people turned around and started booing and jeering us. I had never experienced anything quite like that in 40 years in the business. That same hostility continued the very next morning when I was leaving Baton Rouge on the way back to Washington, D.C. on an airplane of all places, and a gentleman across the aisle from me spotted my CBS luggage tag on my carry-on bag and started mouthing off at me. I clearly understood that he was following the president-elect's lead on his feelings with the press. On Inauguration Day, I was in the so-called press pool. And for those of you that don't understand what the pool means, we have 5 networks, of course, and each day a different network goes out with the president in the bubble, covering them close up, whether it's on Air Force One on an overseas trip, a trip around the States, or to just cover events at the White House. And luckily, what happens is on those days, there's no advantage to being in the pool on those days. Everything is shared with all 5 networks at the same time. All editorial information and all video that's shot by your camera crew. It's all distributed at the same time. And that's why you'll see when the president made statements today about Las Vegas, there's a countdown and everybody, all the network controllers have one videotape. In fact, it was CBS's turn today to shoot that when the president made those comments, and they distributed it at the same time. Luckily, on January 20th, it was CBS's turn to be in the travel pool, and I had the honor. So I got to witness the last hours of President Obama's term of office and the beginning of President Trump. That morning, we were called into the Rose Garden for a photo op, and there we saw, through the glass windows of the Oval Office, President Obama penning a letter to Donald Trump to welcome him to the White House. He left that envelope on top of the desk and then left the French doors of the Oval Office onto the colonnade for the very last time. We watched him from the Rose Garden walking along the colonnade, and he really looked lost in his thoughts. I called out to him, "Mr. President, are you feeling a bit nostalgic now?" He paused and he looked down, he looked up at me and he said, "Of course." A few minutes later, he was joined by Michelle Obama on the North Portico, where they welcomed the Trump motorcade to the White House for the first time, and the two couples retreated inside for a ceremonial tea before going up to Capitol Hill for the oath of office. A short time later, we were back in the motorcade, and we were following the two couples up to Capitol Hill. We left the compound of the White House and turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue. And I remember saying to my cameraman as we were right in front of the White House, "Look," I said, the bleachers right in front of the White House, they're really kind of empty." I had no idea that crowd size would become such a big issue the very next day. After the swearing in, we returned to the White House, and President Trump was in the reviewing stand watching the parade and so forth going by the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. A short time later, inside, we were summoned to the Oval Office for his very first executive order signing. That was to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, a much touted campaign promise, and this was to get the ball rolling. Of course, at his side, Vice President Pence, and of course, son-in-law Jared Kushner. A short time later, we left for the inaugural balls that evening. There were 3 of them. As we sped through the streets of Washington that Friday night, we went through an area with lots of bars and restaurants and crowds walking out on the street. The crowds on the street were decidedly hostile when that motorcade went by, and they were booing it. Some even offered one-fingered salutes as the motorcade went by. But when we got to the D.C. Convention Center, the site of the first inaugural ball, it was an entirely different scene. Thousands upon thousands of people cheering on the new president and first lady. It was a formal affair. Everybody was in black tie, and the press was asked to dress accordingly, and we did. There I was, crouched in front of the stage in my tuxedo, crouched on the floor so as not to block the view of his followers behind me standing there. And his remarks were, as you'd expect, joyous, of course, at the victory and what lay ahead. And suddenly, for the first time as president, again, he started beating up on the press verbally. As I crouched on the floor in the tuxedo, I suddenly looked up as I was taking notes to the crowd standing behind me, and they were looking at us with disdain and contempt. Of course, every administration, Democrat or Republican, they find fault with stories that are published or broadcast. And believe me, they all let you know about it, whether the correspondent or the organization. But never before have we had such a constant drum roll attacking the press on almost a daily basis in some situations. Reporting must be factual. It must not be biased. In fact, in campaign years, when I was on the trail with various candidates, I didn't even vote for president on those years. I wanted to keep my neutrality. I just felt I was too close to it. The overwhelming majority of journalists have great integrity. This whole thing hits very close to home for me. See, I've lost a couple of friends who have been killed in war zones just doing their jobs. Others I know have lost their limbs due to improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan and Iraq. I have been shot at. Fortunately, was not hurt. There are great sacrifices made by these men and women, journalists in the field, whether they're covering stories around our country or overseas, all to keep us well informed. It bothers me to be booed and jeered and have our leadership encourage that type of behavior. We need a free press. People now tend to only watch cable networks that most agree or align with their points of view. Young people aren't reading newspapers. They're not watching the network newscast anymore. They're relying on Twitter, blogs, YouTube, Facebook for their information. That wasn't the way it was when I started covering Ronald Reagan in his second term in terms of press coverage. Back then, Reagan was interested in getting improved relationships with Mikhail Gorbachev, and I went along with him on his first trip to Geneva, Switzerland in 1985. They had their first session there, and there was a total news blackout. Nobody knew what had transpired there, but everybody was quite intrigued, as you probably remember. At the time, I had heard that Jesse Jackson and a group of human rights activists had come to Geneva and were camped outside of the Soviet consulate there. So I took a camera crew, went down there, and decided to see what that was all about. When we arrived, we were the only Western press there. And suddenly, the group, along with myself and the camera crew, were invited inside to the consulate. I thought maybe they were going to offer up a low-level Soviet official to meet with this group. We went inside, and within about a minute or so in the reception area, the doors flung open, and in walked Mikhail Gorbachev himself. I knew we were going to have a network exclusive. For 45 minutes, Gorbachev sat there talking to Jesse Jackson and the group, with us standing there and cameras rolling the entire time. I got to ask Gorbachev a question at that point about how he got on with Reagan, what's transpired, how are relations coming along here? And he answered through a translator that we are for open doors. This was the new era of glasnost, the new Russia. I remember running out of the consulate at the end of that and going back to the International Press Center there where my bosses at the time for the McNeil-era NewsHour were pontificating about who they were going to book as a guest on the show that night to discuss this very important summit meeting and first step. And I burst in there and I said, hey, I just got an exclusive with Gorbachev on camera. Their jaws dropped open and word spread like wildfire. They couldn't believe it. The other networks were, clamoring to get a copy of that videotape. Ronald Reagan was a really look-good, feel-good president. He could deliver a marvelous teleprompter speech. He had a very good sense of humor as well. Sadly, near the end of his second term, I noticed that he was having difficulties at answering impromptu questions, things that weren't scripted out. And I thought in retrospect that perhaps that was the beginning of his development of Alzheimer's. And of course, it wasn't acknowledged that he had that until, about 3 or 4 years after he left office. Of course, following Reagan was George H.W. Daddy Bush. He was one of the first vice presidents to become president, and he had a most impressive resume, probably the most impressive resume going into the presidency of contemporary times. But he may be remembered most for the following line: read my lips, no new taxes, and perhaps the Gulf War. At the time, I was a foreign affairs producer for the McNeil-era NewsHour, and I was dispatched to Baghdad, where we were to try to get interviews with the leadership about why they had invaded and taken over Kuwait. It was a very dangerous time to be in Baghdad. Western men were being taken as human shields to strategic sites around that country to keep the Americans from bombing. I remember arriving there with $20,000 in cash. Sounds like a good chunk of change, but you have to consider there were no credit cards accepted, and the official government exchange rate was slightly out of reality with what it should have been. To give you an example, I think we bought 5 sandwiches in the first days and 5 Coca-Colas, and it cost something equivalent of about $250. So I knew our money wasn't going to last long, and that would curtail our being able to report from there. So I decided to look around for a way to make our money go further. And I spotted a little grocery shop down by the American Embassy, and I thought, well, let me check out prices there. Maybe we can get some food there and eat our meals in the hotel room and make our stay last longer and the money last longer. So the prices were good, and I said to the young man inside, I'll be back. I have to go get more change. Change, he says? Yeah, I have to go get more Iraqi dinar. With that, he yells, Papa! Papa, this burly guy, comes barreling down the steps. I was nervous as hell because Nobody knew where I was, and if these people found out I was American, I'm toast. I'd probably be called up to one of these strategic sites. So he comes up and he says, "What country you come from?" I shook and stammered a bit, and I finally said, "Sweden." His eyes got big. Uh-oh, what did I say? "Sweden, very good country. I used to work there. Beautiful women. I change money for it. But you no tell. Change money. And I go back to the famous Al Rashid Hotel, where my colleague at the time, Charlene Hunter-Gall, was awaiting me. And she was furious at me. She thought I had been nabbed because I had been gone a long time. I said, "Look, I'm really sorry I upset you. I'll tell you what, I'll buy you a bottle of wine with dinner tonight." She said, "A bottle of wine? Are you out of your mind? We don't have enough money to eat. How are we going to afford a bottle of wine?" I said, I pull out my pocket a stack of Iraqi dinar this big. I said, "I have a friend." Her eyes got big. She said, "We can't tell anybody about this. We've got to have a code name for this guy. How about Alibaba?" Well, Alibaba kept us alive and well and able to work in Iraq for many more weeks after that due to his favorable exchange rates. From there, we moved from Baghdad onto Saudi Arabia to await the American troop liberation of Kuwait, and it took quite a long time. While we were in Saudi, some people that I had met there invited us for dinner one night at their family farm. Picture the scene, sitting on the desert sand, on Persian carpets, cushions, and a lamb roasting on a fire pit and spit in front of us. While we're sitting there chatting, all of a sudden, Scud missiles started flying overhead of us towards Riyadh. Of course, the Iraqis were trying to get at the American troops who were poised there, ready to launch for the liberation of Kuwait. That liberation eventually took place, of course, and it was a feather in the cap of George H.W. Daddy Bush. But that victory was short-lived, as we all saw in hindsight. George H.W. Bush only had one term in office, and he was defeated by that little-known governor up in Arkansas, Bill Clinton, 1992. I was in Little Rock that night, and after a sleepless night, I decided I'm going to go to the gym. I can't sleep, and in the pre-dawn hours, I go there, and I'm getting on the exercise machine. Nobody there. Suddenly, I sensed somebody coming in the door and getting on the machine nearby, and I looked up. It wasn't just anybody, it was Bill Clinton himself. We had this great chat. Unfortunately, my camera crew wasn't there. They were sleeping. Of course, Bill Clinton may be remembered most for his affair with the nice Jewish girl, Monica Lewinsky. But he did try very hard over his 8 years to get the ball rolling for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. And in 1993, as mentioned before, I was on the south lawn of the White House to witness this historic event with Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and Bill Clinton all shaking hands for peace. It was quite a moment. The air was very positive, and people thought, maybe at long last, something will move on that situation. I was dispatched to the Middle East to get the opinions of the regional leaders at that time, and we got interviews, as mentioned, with Hosni Mubarak at his very lavish palace in Alexandria, Egypt. And then Mubarak, ironically, helped us to get the interview with Hafiz al-Assad up in Damascus, Syria. He hadn't talked to the Western press in many years. Onwards, we went to Amman, Jordan, and spoke to King Hussein, and finished that tour in Jerusalem interviewing Shimon Peres of Israel. It was a thrill to meet Peres, of course, because he was one of the last living founding fathers of the modern state of Israel. All of them were very optimistic about the future at that point, well, except for old man Assad, who was certainly blindsided by the sudden negotiations. So here we are today, 24 years later after that historic handshake. What's changed? Frankly and sadly, not much. Next up in dealing with that part of the world, of course, was George W. Bush. At the time, Israel was about to turn over the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians and parts of the West Bank. So we went to the Gaza to interview the Israeli settlers and the Palestinians there about their thoughts. The Israeli settlers, of course, were very upset. Many of those people we interviewed had been uprooted once before. You see, they lived in settlements in the Sinai. And when Israel gave that territory back to Egypt, they moved. Where did they move? Gaza. Here they were, again, faced with this terrible dilemma, but they were resigned that they had to move on. The Palestinians, on the other hand, were obviously more optimistic. Maybe their lives would improve. The conditions in the Gaza, few people have been there, I can tell you are really wretched. Raw sewage in the streets and just terrible conditions. But as I looked around there at the time, I thought, well, there's potential here. This could be developed into a port city. Maybe even the beaches down the road could be beach resort areas further down the Mediterranean. But of course, none of that ever happened, and it still is a squalid place. It was also during the George W. Bush administration, I covered the Iraqi war that was brought on by the September 11th attack on America. I was at the White House that September 11th morning, watching on the TV monitors in our little office there as the Twin Towers were crumbling. I had no idea that just down the road and across the river, the Pentagon would soon come under attack. The Secret Service came scrambling in there and yelled at us to evacuate immediately. We ran out of the White House. As we ran out, we saw nearby office buildings, people fleeing, trying to get to their loved ones to safety. It was a terrible day in Washington, a terrible day in New York, and I'm sure a terrible day here for you watching in Ann Arbor. Soon after that, I was dispatched to Ground Zero with then Attorney General John Ashcroft and newly appointed FBI Director Robert Mueller, who's in the news again, of course, in contemporary times. He had only been in the job as the FBI Director then for 1 week. We went to Ground Zero, and we were right next to the still smoldering steel infrastructure of what had been the Twin Towers. Workers were still sifting through the debris near us, looking for anything they could find. We then went over to a secret FBI garage location on the West Side Highway of Manhattan, where a nerve center operation was set up with about 1,000 agents and others looking at clues, trying to figure out who perpetrated this heinous crime on America. And after we left there, we got on helicopters and went round and round above Ground Zero, looking straight down. It's an image I'll never get out of my mind. On the way back on that FBI jet to Washington, Attorney General Ashcroft sat silently. But Robert Mueller looked at me and another fellow and said, off the record, I just need to talk about what we just saw. I paused and I said to him, we were all extremely moved by those images. Soon, I was back in the Middle East when Congress declared war in Iraq, but this time, I went to Kuwait for 5 months, and covering the lead up to the war and the war itself. And while there, I reconnected with the Kuwaiti businessman I had met in the first Gulf War. He invited me to his men's club meetings. They were regular meetings, and they were called Diwania, and kind of similar to men's club meetings you might have here at your local synagogues and temples. In fact, the ladies had their own meetings, maybe like sisterhood, but they met separately as well. His group were all very highly educated Kuwaitis. They had studied university in England and the States, many of them. They were doctors, lawyers, business people. They discussed the war, of course, politics, and much to my surprise, they discussed Israel. They were all favorably disposed at leaving Israel alone, doing more trade with them, possibly. Business is business. And in fact, Israel's doing business with a lot of Muslim countries, a lot of times through back channels now, but it's going on. One thing that they imparted to me, though, during that time, these Kuwaitis, was that once Saddam Hussein was out of Iraq, the real bloodbath would begin. They understood the difference between the Sunni and Shia communities there. It was also during the George W. Bush administration that I went with him to Moscow on Air Force One to meet Vladimir Putin. Early on in George W.'s administration, he met Putin, of course, and he went on camera, Bush did, and declared he had looked into Putin's eyes and found him to be a trustworthy man. Well, I was the pool person there. The two of them were sitting in front of a beautiful fireplace, and the photo op began. And I called out to President Bush, "President Bush, do you still trust President Putin?" With that, the Russian press handlers started yanking us out of there as quickly as they could. They didn't like that question. As I was walking out, President Bush looked at me and he said, "Nice try." With that, Putin started laughing. He clearly understood. Bush's last year in office, he went to Israel for the 60th anniversary of that nation. As I stood there on the tarmac next to Air Force One watching the welcoming ceremony, I thought about all of the similar ceremonies I had been to around the world many times in different countries. But this one was special, reflecting about all the accomplishment that Israel had made in its first 60 years. In 2008, of course, Barack Obama was elected as the first minority president, and he too tried to pick up the pieces in the Middle East. In fact, I was with him on his first secret trip to that region. We had been in Istanbul, Turkey for a state visit there, and the day we were leaving, I had Air Force One duty back to Washington. When we took off from Istanbul, I noticed we weren't, because of the sun direction, we weren't heading west towards Washington, we were going east. I wondered, where are we going? Could we be going to Afghanistan or Iraq maybe? Normally you can look at the TV monitors like you can on commercial planes to see where the jet's position, but the military security guys turned off those TV monitors to keep mission secrecy. So we flew for about an hour and a half east, and suddenly Air Force One banked sharply to the right or south. I looked out the window, and down below I saw a great river. Could that be the Euphrates or Tigris, I thought? We must be going to Iraq. After a while, the plane started lowering in altitude, and the military put Air Force One into what you would call a corkscrew landing. It was a dizzying affair. But the military, of course, had done that to keep Air Force One from any anti-aircraft fire or surface-to-air missiles. That would have been quite a target on the horizon, as you can imagine. Just before landing, the press secretary rushed back and said, "Yes, President Obama is going to meet with the Iraqi leadership in the so-called secure green zone of Baghdad, and then talk to American troops." But once we got on the ground, plans had to change. There was a sudden sandstorm, the likes of which looked like Hollywood special effects movie. You couldn't see this far in front of your face with that sand. And of course, Marine One and the other choppers couldn't take off and go to the planned destination. So the Iraqi leadership came to meet him at Camp Liberty. There were lots of trips that Obama took that were ceremonial in nature, not heavy duty, like the time he went with Michelle Obama to England, where they met the Queen. Michelle Obama created quite a stir, a royal no-no in protocol. She hugged Her Majesty. The British press had a heyday with that, but Her Majesty didn't seem to mind at all. There were other poignant trips, of course, that Obama took, like to Normandy for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. There I watched Obama and the other leaders walking upon row after row after row, thousands of men who had given their lives for their countries during that terrible time. It was quite emotional to watch them doing that, and the reactions on their faces. After they left, I got a chance to go into that same cemetery all alone, and I walked some of those same rows. Only every time I came across a Star of David marker, I stopped and I put a stone there, thinking about the sacrifices these men had made and the fact that in many cases their families probably have never been able to do that honor of laying a stone to mark their visit. It was emotional to see, as you can imagine. You know, I've covered 6 wars, as mentioned, in military incursion, the Balkan Wars, the war in Somalia, the ousting of Manuel Noriega in Panama, the Civil War in El Salvador. There were many stories that were very hard to witness, including the aftermath of the tsunami in Thailand, where I accompanied then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And I'll never forget Haiti in the aftermath of that terrible earthquake there that took the lives of over 160,000 people. One glimmer of hope, we hit the ground there, and I was one of the first reporters there with the search and rescue team. And when we got there, we saw thousands of bodies laying in the streets, people wandering around aimlessly, looking for loved ones, children in a company looking for their parents. It was really heartbreaking. One glimmer of hope, though, was I spotted an Israeli plane landing with teams of doctors and nurses that were there to set up mobile field hospitals to help the survivors there. They were one of the first countries in there after the Americans. And as you know, Jewish Federation helped in efforts greatly in Haiti, as they have in recent hurricanes, and seeing things like that in Haiti firsthand, and now these other places, really is something that we should all remember and support. It's great things that they do. Conditions in Haiti were terrible. There was very little water, very little food, no bathing, of course, and it was hot as hell, and it was really a tough place to work and sleeping on the ground. After about a week there, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton showed up, and CBS said, "We need you to go interview her." And I saw her, and when she saw me, she extended her arm to shake my hand. I said, "Madam Secretary, trust me, you do not want to shake my hand." She looked at me quizzically. I said, I motioned to my front and my arms and my pants and everything. I said, "Look at me, I'm covered in schmutz." She laughed and backed off, clearly seeing what condition I was in. Of course, Haiti wasn't the only tragic thing I saw with really terrible conditions. Somalia was like that, watching the starvation there, being there in terrible conditions also, the heat, little food, little water, and so forth. And finally, it was also a very dangerous place to be because everybody had weapons, and of course we didn't. The American troops went in there, of course, and they did great work to stop the starvation and get the supply chain going with food and aid to those poor people. But that mission all soured, of course, when something you may remember happened called Black Hawk Down, the American helicopter that was shot down, and the service members killed on board that, whose bodies were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. It was a terrible, terrible scene. And of course, the Americans left that mission soon after that. And to this day, Somalia, of course, is in chaos. I also witnessed the aftermath of the genocide in the Balkans. Nearby European countries did nothing to stop the bloodshed there. It was the Americans who went in there, and they saved the Muslim population in Bosnia. I was in Tuzla for a couple of months. That's the second largest city there, a city that's about 98% Muslim. There was a strict curfew there for the 2 months. They lifted it only on Christmas Eve. And a colleague of mine said, "Hey, do you want to go to Christmas Eve services with me?" I said, "Sure." There was one church there. The place was jammed with mostly young people. And I said to my colleague, "These can't all be Christian people. They must be Muslims that want to get out because of the curfew being lifted." Suddenly, 2 young men in front of us piped up and spoke some English and said, "Yeah, you're right. We are Muslim. We wanted to get out of the house tonight." One decided to practice his English with me, and he says, "Tell me, are you Catholic or Protestant? I said, neither. I'm actually Jewish. His eyes got big. He said, I never met a Jewish before. I said, well, now you have. My name's Jeff. It's really good to meet you. He paused and he thought for a moment. Then he said, tell me, is it true that the Jews have all the money? I said, no. I couldn't imagine where he had gotten this from. There hadn't been Jews in that part of the Balkans in many decades. Clearly it was passed on generationally. And that wasn't the only place I experienced anti-Semitism covering stories abroad. In 1990, I was in Lithuania for the first free parliamentary elections when that country broke away from the old Soviet Union. We covered a candidates forum. There were about 9 people speaking that night. One of them, by real surprise to me, was a Jewish candidate. When you consider that Vilnius, or Vilna as was called in pre-war, there was a population of about 100,000 Jews, and now there was less than 3,000. We weren't there to do a story about the Jewish candidate. We were there about the democratic process. And afterwards, we started interviewing people about their thoughts about this new democracy and what was happening here. One after one, unprompted by us, they started railing against the Jewish guy. I wouldn't vote for a Jew, and the Jews this and Jews that. My heart sank listening to this. I'm the son of a Lithuanian Jewish mother whose family was killed there in World War II. Recently, about 6 weeks ago, I went back to Lithuania on a roots trip with my mom. And I found out something kind of surprising when I was there, that Jewish candidate, in spite of what was said about him in our interviews, was actually elected to parliament. And 27 years later, he's still a very prominent member of parliament. On that same trip, I went with my mom to her hometown of Trakai, Lithuania, which is a beautiful place of lakes and sailboats and a castle on an island in the middle of the lake. But it was also a place of great tragedy for our family, where in 1941, they were killed in a forest a couple miles outside of town. Not by the Germans, but by the locals. In that forest, we found a mass grave and discovered that 1,466 people were killed there. And of that number, almost 600 children, including our family. And we sat there all alone in that forest and said Kaddish for them. Then I watched my mom pick up the wildflower she found out there, placing it on the marker. And she spoke to that marker in Yiddish. And she said her name, and that she had come back. It was really emotional to watch that, of course, thinking about what I was watching and experiencing. And of course, anti-Semitism and the rise of Nazi parties all over Europe is very troubling in present tense. And we can't, of course, forget about what's happening here in our own country, as recently shown in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the mixed signals and messages sent from the top on what's right and what's wrong. It's something we all have to consider going forward. Various presidents, of course, deal with crises all the time. Trump today with Las Vegas and Puerto Rico and the other hurricane issues recently. But one trouble spot around the world that keeps coming back and all the time is the Middle East and Israel. It's a constant. I remember being in the Oval Office watching Bibi Netanyahu sitting there at a meeting with Barack Obama. The cable networks were carrying this all live. Bibi was lecturing President Obama on the history of the Palestinians and Jews. Obama sat there politely, but clearly he knew that history. Those two never got along on a lot of things, including the settlement issue, of course. But Obama faced a lot of other issues here at home. The gridlock on Capitol Hill. Nothing was being accomplished. Increasingly, Democrats and Republicans around the country were infuriated at the lack of action there. And of course, this may have contributed to the victory of Donald Trump, because he, after all, was the one that said he would drain the swamp in Washington. I covered a lot of elections, as mentioned, including cliffhangers, like the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, right on through this recent election with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, with a surprise ending, at least for some. When the dust settled down a little bit, later in December, President Obama took his last trip to Hawaii, his home state, for a holiday. I was the pool reporter on that trip, and the White House found out that this might be my last time on Air Force One and that I'd soon be retiring. So on board, the press secretary surprised me, and he came back without notice and said, "The president would like to see you now in his private cabin." I had no time to collect my thoughts about what I was going to say to the president as we walked up the aisles of Air Force One up to the front. And suddenly I remembered I had a bunch of luggage tags in my breast pocket. We made these tags up for every domestic and foreign trip. This time it was done a little tongue-in-cheek, though, with a little photoshopping. And it was a picture of President Obama wearing a Santa cap, swimming in the Pacific Ocean off the shores of Diamond Head. I came in and I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I got something your daughters might get a kick out of here." He looked at these things and started laughing. He says, "Forget my daughters, these are great." We had a really nice chat. And on the way out of his cabin, going back to the press area in the very back of the plane, he says, "Hey, wait a minute, you should have one of these." With that, he gets a Sharpie marker pen and he writes on the front, "To Jeff, congratulations on a great career." It was a poignant moment for me, thinking about all that I had seen and witnessed in 40 years in this business, starting back in the old Jeff Scott days in Birmingham to the present. And it's something I won't forget, of course. There's so many memories and anecdotes I could tell you over this 40-year period, of course, and not a lot of time for that. But I'd be happy to take your questions on various presidents, press relations, or even what it's like to fly around the world many times over on Air Force One. But it's really been a pleasure to be with you here tonight, and I applaud the efforts that you all do.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Jeff is going to be around during the dessert reception, so I'm sure he'd be delighted to take any questions. We want to give you this gift on our, it's a little something from us, from the Jewish community, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank you all for coming to share this evening with us. Thank you for your generosity and for your dedication. I look forward to having many conversations with you about how we can continue and expand the positive energy we have here in this room for the benefit of our community. A heartfelt thank you to Carey, David, Cindy, and Scott for their involvement in making this evening so special and successful. We look forward to seeing you all in just 1 month's time at the main event, Monday, November 6th at the Washtenaw Community College. In appreciation of your enduring support and as an enticement for you to attend the main event, we have a gift for you as you leave, a Nat Admoni's cookbook, Balabusta. You may take it with you tonight. If you want it signed, you can either leave it with us and we'll bring it to you at the main event, or if you want to start using it straight away, and I think you might want to, feel free to bring it to the main event and have it signed there. You'll be at the front of the line for signing. I also, just a little detail, if you've parked in the far parking lot, please go through the building as opposed to outside because the lighting is better through the building. Anyway, I just wish you all a very happy, healthy, and sweet New Year and a Chag Sukkot Sameach, and thank you very much.